I'm going to start out today's lecture with a quote. I define beauty to be a harmony of all the parts, fitted together with such proportion and connection that nothing could be added, diminished, or altered but for the worse. This is Leon Battista Alberti, 1406 to 1472. And he was a Renaissance universal man, an Italian author, artist, architect, poet, linguist, philosopher, and cryptographer. So we'll continue talking about the formal elements of design today, so those being line, shape, value, color, texture, and format. Starting with line, let's look at these 6 little examples of line. We have the upper left, which is very uniform, vertical, black. There's white, evenly spaced lines, or black, evenly spaced lines, depending on what you consider to be the negative space. And you might describe this as very orderly and conservative. Same with the upper right. There's uniform, horizontal black lines. They're widely spaced but evenly spaced. Static, stable, orderly would be kind of descriptive words to describe it. Middle left, there's a little bit of uneven spacing occurring here in these otherwise uniform lines, and this kind of creates the impression of movement. So instead of being conservative or static, you might describe this one as more dynamic. It's still very orderly, but there's an orderly progression, but it's getting a little bit more energy. The same with the middle right. In this example, the progression moves in from either side. It kind of gives the illusion of roundness. It is a little more dynamic than the first two, and it still has this orderly progression and dimension, but the energy is a little bit more increased. The lower left, the lines vary. The widths and distance create this kind of random pattern. It's more dynamic. It's a little bit, perhaps you might describe it as chaotic and even disorderly. Whereas lower right, these lines are uniform, they're evenly spaced, but because they're curved, you get this sense of movement. It could be described as a controlled movement, but there feels like there's a visual flow occurring, and it's a little bit more dynamic. Here's an example of an album cover done where line was the primary element. This was the Velvet Crush, and you can see that it's very simple, flat color lines. The varying line widths make a little bit of a difference. So if you see it's very subtle, but the line widths vary slightly. And there's a little bit of a texture to the line. They're not just straight black. You see the edges of the lines kind of go in a little bit. Little textural elements in there. And then you have this element back here that looks like it's going into the distance because the line is very thin. It's not as weighted. Alter Ego was a book design in 2006. And if you notice these facial expressions, when you draw a face, the slightest variance in line can change an expression. It's pretty fascinating. Here's a 1995 MTV Video Music Award program, and the purpose of this program was to entertain and inform attendees of the 1993 MTV Video Music Awards. And the idea being, what if sex, drugs, and rock and roll become in the 90s? That was the concept. And there was just lines everywhere, all over these, very playful lines filled the space. You can see that lots of little graphics in there, some hand-drawn text. But the energy, if you do line illustrations, you can be quite playful. It becomes, the energy is very dynamic. Here's a more conservative example of a line illustration. This was a trip to the Yosemite Valley, I think. And you can see these beautiful line illustrations on the cover and then in the pages themselves. You can see there was a little bit of a color variance here. And, this was very sophisticated. Here's another book designed in 1999 called Adultery. And this was a memoir and a cultural study, kind of a literary exploration and a survivor's memoir where an author offers a sexy, non-judgmental, and realistic vision of fidelity in marriage. And lines seem to fit the subject matter in the sense that the handwriting got kind of blurred, kind of distorted. It seemed to work for the design. Notice this graphic here where you have the lines in the background are much softer. They even break at certain parts, whereas the lines in the foreground are much more bold. And you can see there's contrast occurring. And even though there's not a lot of distinction between the scale of the chairs, there is a real feeling of depth occurring just with this subtle variation in the tone of the line, in the contrast. Line can be used to describe flat shapes, and here you can see that line kind of unifies the design and creates the same style for the whole piece, so it's kind of bringing it all together. There's all these little graphics, but then the lines really connect and almost form a grid for these little graphics to kind of exist on. This was a beautiful ad, or a really effective ad on trying to find a job, and you can see they had all these bold lines. You know, it's supposed to be like newspaper text, but it actually was just simple bold lines going all throughout the page, and then the actual copy were in these little rectangles here. This is Joseph Mueller Brockman. He did a beautiful book on the grid system, and we'll be talking more about him later in the semester, but you can see how this cover was all about line, the shading, the sense of depth, all just from these variations in, you know, the tonality of the line, and it was really beautifully done. So line creates shape, representational shapes. So when we draw, we create shape. That's usually what happens. And shape can be described as the general outline of something, a closed form or a path. And design is simply the arrangement of shapes, including spaces between shapes and shapes created by overlap. So there are both representational shapes and non-representational shapes. So here's some examples of both of those. One's more kind of rectilinear and one is more curvilinear. This shape would be, I would perhaps describe it as more organic. By closing the form here, a shape is created, and it's called a closed path. So when you start working with Illustrator, you'll start working with the pen tool, and you'll create shapes. And when you connect one point and you draw something and then you reconnect back at that original point, it's called a closed path. If you never connect at the original point, it's called an open path. Another way to create shape other than an outline is using just a flat area of color, and this does not have to be surrounded by line. Value refers to the relative lightness or darkness of a certain area, and value can be used for emphasis. Variations in value are used to create a focal point for the design or the picture. So this is an example of high contrast, where the difference between the lightest and darkest values in an image are very extreme. And high contrast images have a large range of values from the darkest shadow to the lightest highlight. Shape can be ambiguous to some extent with negative and positive. So here you see this black might be described as the positive, but then the white also could be described as positive. So there's a little bit of ambiguity happening. And often when we, create designs, we really need to consider the shape that the negative space is becoming, because that can really determine whether the design is going to be interesting. So always look at that negative space, look at what shape is happening back there. So value we've talked about a little bit, but this is an example of a low contrast image. It's very sophisticated. There's a much more narrow range of values, and it can result in a flatter look. And sometimes if there's not enough contrast, this flatness can make it unappealing. You don't really want to look at it. It has to be done really well for it to be successful. So low contrast images often need to be appropriate for whatever you're looking at. They can be quite successful, but you have to be careful. Our eye naturally wants to see contrast. So if you have something that's a really high contrast image, it'll just pop out and our eye will want to look at it. Okay, so just here's an example of kind of using shape and line together. You can see the outline of this binder here. This is a Levi Strauss promotional item. And then you see the shape, the rectangle in the center kind of pulls the focus. You have the little illustrations on here, the logo. Here was a beautiful cover for Computer Arts Projects. It's a magazine, and you can just see all the detail in the background. It was very subtle and almost kind of disappeared into the space. There was this transparency effect happening. And you notice that this becomes the primary focal point, but then everything else your eye kind of starts to explore and see all the different words in the background here. Example of high contrast. Here's a Russian constructivist poster. We talked about this a little bit before. And constructivist typography developed its own kind of distinctive look. Letters and words were at right angles to each other, and they were framed by these bold rulers and borders, and usually printed in one or two primary colors. And type and image arrangements had this strong diagonal emphasis with this style, with this Russian constructivist style. And often it kind of contrasted with this photo montage where there was a black and white photograph. And we'll talk more about this movement later in the course. Here's another example and another example. So, example of line and design. And this is a beautiful poster called The Begotten, which I think I talked about in an earlier lecture, but just a nice example of shape and of contrast, of value. Some shape ambiguity happening here. And this was a problem. How do you create negative and positive ambiguity? And this was the solution. What's positive, what's negative? It was all created with letters, and we'll kind of be doing something similar a little further on in the course. This is a beautiful photograph, and I love this straight line of text that just connects these two together, the ear and the mouth. You can see the really intense framing, makes you want to look, and then you kind of lean in to read what they're talking about here. This was an advertising campaign by Avia, and you notice how there's a lot of contrast here. There's definitely shape being used in this campaign, and if you look at these photographs, what's really great about them is they're just the body, the shape of the body. You don't really associate the identity of the person being photographed inside of the frame here. You really just see this beautiful body. It could be any person's body that was in shape. And so that was what Avia was trying to do. They wanted the viewer to kind of project themselves into the photos. They didn't want to be too specific about the identity of the people they were photographing. Here's a famous artist named Escher. We'll talk about him a little bit. He did these beautiful woodcuts where there was this real space ambiguity occurring. And he was a Dutch graphic artist. He's known for his often mathematically inspired woodcuts, lithographs, and mezzotints. And these kind of feature impossible constructions, explorations of infinity. So just kind of look at a few of these. They're amazing to look at, and you can see this real sense of depth occurring. These just go on and on and on. There's no end. Here's another beautiful example. You can see this space ambiguity occurring and this kind of spatial confusion in this piece. Look at the beautiful animal shapes and how they all interact and mingle together. And there's just no negative space. It's really amazing. This is also Escher. So texture refers to the surface quality of objects, and it often appeals to our sense of touch, even when we do not actually feel an object. Our memory provides a sensory reaction. In design, texture can be used to create a particular feeling or mood. So here's an example of a car. I just want to reach out and touch this car. This was a fur-covered cup and saucer. You can see that in two-dimensional art, texture can be created with repetition. So if you repeat a shape many times, there's often a textural effect that occurs. Here's an example of creating texture just with hand-drawn type. Here's a photograph of some tree bark. It creates this really distinct texture. And here's a beautiful illustration for Edgar Allan Poe's Tales of Mystery and Imagination. And you can see there's just these little tiny detail areas where there's this just little tiny circles, and they just get repeated, or little tiny shapes that are repeated over and over again to create these larger shapes. And it just gives this immense feeling of texture. There's just so much going on in there. Here's a famous Lou Reed album cover.